Hi, I'm Stuart the platform architect of the Slackware ARM port. And in this video, I'm going to show you installing Slackware AArch64 onto the Rock Pro 64. I'll talk to you about what's going on with this setup here during the installation. But to begin with, I've got my SD card, my micro SD card, and on this SD card is the Slackware installer and the kernel, and this is what you'll be able to download and then DD it, copy it onto your own SD card. Now this is the Pine64 case, and I got this from the Pine64 store. I always use cases on my ARM boards because I don't really like denuded hardware. I like to have a case on them. And I've got to say, it's a really good build quality. It's very strong, and it's got various different pre-drilled holes, which are really quite helpful because I've put the cables through them. You need holes in the case for the serial adapter and some other stuff as well. So that's all set up. So I've got my SD card. I've already DD'd the image onto it with the installer on it, and I'm now going to put it into the Rock Pro 64. The only thing I've got to say is that with this case, it does have a slot and it does have a gap here, but it is still a little bit fiddly to get it in, but it's doable. Okay, I heard the click, so it's in. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do, as I said, I'll talk to you about what's going on here. I've got this ATX power supply here on the table, and that's for a couple of things. It's powering the hard drive and it's powering the fan. I'll explain to you why I've done it that way, because you don't actually have to. Earlier on, I did have the whole thing encased in the box running purely off the Rock Pro 64's own power, but I'll talk to you about why I've done that later. So we're going to plug that in to begin with, and you'll hear the fan noise perhaps in the video, because the fan's now running on 12 volts, it's on full power. Okay, so I've got my USB to serial adapter there in the side of this x86 laptop, and for the installation of Slackware AArch64, I'm going to suggest that you install using the serial adapter, but you can do it over SSH, and you can also, although I don't have one on my desk here, but you will also be able to install directly using an HDMI monitor and USB keyboard and mouse. I have done that and it works perfectly fine. But what I always do, and I always suggest, is that you install over the serial port, and that you at all times you have this serial adapter. In fact, I don't know if I can see it from here, but let's give that a go. But you should, there's the serial adapter wires there, the ground and the receive and the transmit, so you've got the fan running at full whack, and I'll talk to you a bit later about that. You can watch my fingers run. Cut it on the fan. Okay, so we've got the TTY USB 0, and now I'm just going to open up a screen session to connect to the Rock Pro 64. So I'm just going to run a script that I've got that does the settings. All of the settings for this will be on the documentation on the website. Okay, so currently there's nothing on the screen at all, because just a flashing cursor. I'm now going to plug the power into the Rock Pro 64. So the power socket's just here at the back, like that. So I'll just plug that in, and then, then the only thing I need to do, so at this point I've got everything set up, the power is there, the serial adapter is ready, it's waiting. The only thing we need to do is turn it on with the power button. So this is the front of the case here. As you can see, the USB ports are exposed, so that makes it really handy. And you've got the power button, and you've got the reset button, and you've also got a microphone port as well. So I'm just going to turn it on. I suppose I could press it. Yeah, to be honest, the only thing about this case, I do find it difficult, is to actually get my finger into the hole, so I'm going to use a screwdriver now, and just to turn it on. So if I press the power, oh, there we go. Okay, quick pan over. I've just interrupted the boot sequence because our camera girl was a little bit slow off the mark, weren't we?
Hey, Dave.
You can see here I've just interrupted the boot sequence. Now my assistant helper. Don't just stop poking things. My goodness. Okay, what you need to do now, Ellie, if you you see that where it says reset on the front.
Yes.
Right,
says,
can you...
Wait, no, where?
This one says, RST, that means reset.
Okay, what do I do?
Get that and poke it in. And then take it out. Yeah, okay, let go now. Okay, so what you're going to see now is the machine is booting. There we go. Okay, so by default, you've got two options. The default is that it will boot the installer off of the SD card. And this takes a few moments to load. As you can see, it's about to start the kernel, and the kernel has started.
It's fast.
Okay, so now I get to choose a keymap. Alright, so the first thing that the Slackware installer does is ask you which keymap you want. So I've got a UK keymap on this laptop, so I'm going to do that. I've got the Rock Pro 64 plugged into the network already, so it's going to get an IP from DHCP. And it generates an SSH key quickly as well, so you can also log in remotely if you want to. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is, this is a brand new 1TB hard drive in here. Well, actually it's not brand new. I found it in the cupboard, and I was quite surprised to find I had a spare 1TB drive. So I'm going to upgrade my machine from a 200 gig to a 1TB. So I'm just going to quickly make the partition table on here with fdisk. Where are we? SDA. You probably can't see that properly on a video, but here we go. So it's already got one partition. I'm just going to delete it, make a new one, make it 8 gig, G, change the type to 82, make a new one, make it bootable to be done. Goes right to the partition table. Yeah, cool. So the partition table is done. We've got, I'll just show you there with fdisk-l. Yeah, so we got 1TB or 923 gigs for Linux, which will be the operating system. Ordinarily, I mean, certainly this is going to be one of the primary build machines for Slackware AArch64. I don't need to be having 1TB. Ordinarily I would perhaps partition this up a bit, but at the moment this is good enough. I've also given myself an 8 gig swap partition, which you don't really need that much swap, but because this is a build machine, it is quite possible that it goes into swap. So I tend to just go on the high side for swap. So what I'm going to do now is just run the setup for Slackware. So this is the standard setup. Everything is the same pretty much as x86 and Slackware ARM. I'm going to begin by adding swap. That was done. Format that, quick format, and hope it doesn't take absolutely ages. Oh, so now you'll see, there we go. Now, I'm just going to point out what you're looking at here on the screen. So, for those of you who are familiar with installing Slackware or Slackware ARM, this is a standard dialog box here. It shows you which, what the root file system is. But you'll see another one underneath where it says Slack or SLK boot AArch64. This is going to be explained in the documentation, but essentially, the SD card that you saw me install into the machine contains the /boot partition for the operating system. So it's dual purpose. It's initially for running the Slackware installer, but subsequent to installing Slackware, the operating system /boot partition will reside on the SD card, and that's where the kernel and the operating system initial RAM disk will also be stored. Thank you, camera girl, if you take it back. You're doing really well with your camera stuff. All right, what I'm going to do...
It's going to be done.
Oh, it's done. These things take time, Right, now...
12 minutes.
Okay, here I'm going to install over NFS because it's what I always do and I've got everything set up to do so. But for the Slackware AArch64 documentation, I'm going to suggest that you install it over HTTP using, because there's a little Python module that brings up a web server in the working directory where you run it from. And so you can far more easily just install over the network, over HTTP, rather than having to go and configure an NFS server and all that kind of stuff. But because I've already got all of those things, I'm using NFS. In this case, I'm going to install everything because this is going to be a build machine. Once I've finished doing this video, it's going to go into the rack and it's going to start building the latest KDE packages. So I'm going to install everything, do a full installation, and you'll see that it starts to install. This takes about, in the previous runs, this takes about half an hour, maybe 35 minutes. I think Brent told me the other day that he had it running, that he had it installed in about 20 minutes. Mine's not quite that fast, but it's still pretty fast. Okay, so I said I'd talk you through what's going on here. Now, for those of you who have a Rock Pro 64 already, or you've perhaps looked into the specs, you might be wondering, why am I powering the fan externally, and what's going on with all of this? Well, it is true that there is a fan socket on board through which you can power the fan, but not only that, you can control the revolutions of the fan in software. And however, and I'm not the only one to experience this, but I've plugged the fan in earlier today, and the board won't even power on when the fan is plugged into the socket. I don't know why. Earlier on, I had a different Rock Pro 64, and I plugged the fan in and it worked fine. So I really don't know what's going on there. But what I do know is that I want the fan running, because this is a build machine. It's going to be running 24/7 building Slackware. So I do want the fan on there. So that's why I've powered the fan externally. And with the hard drives, if you come and have a look at this as well, when I do this kind of thing, sometimes what I do doesn't look that pretty. But basically, I've also powered the SATA hard drive, the 3.5-inch spinning hard drive. I powered that from this ATX power supply here. I put a note out onto one of the local groups where I live, saying that I'm working on this Slackware project, and does anyone have some ATX power supplies? Because I envisaged that I'd be doing this a few months ago. And quite a few people said, yeah, I remember Slackware, and I've got some power supplies you can have. So I ended up with about 6 power supplies in total, so I was really pleased about that. So thanks for that, everyone who gave me those. So the question is, why have I done this? If you look just down here, right, you see this here, this white socket. Oh, thank you. You see that white socket there? That is the power for the hard drives. And in fact, that works perfectly fine. I had another drive earlier powered, and it was working perfectly fine. The reason why I've done it like this and powered the hard drive externally is because through the years of doing this on the ARM platform, I found that over time the power supplies tend to degrade in some way, and it causes the board to malfunction in funny ways, like it won't boot properly, or it's still running but the hard drive starts to spin down and up, and it just makes the whole machine unstable. So even though this board is currently perfectly capable of powering a hard drive, I've decided to, off the bat, just power it externally from this. So I've basically turned this ATX power supply into a bench power supply. If you come over and have a look, this isn't something that I'm suggesting that you have to do. You certainly don't have to do this. I'm just showing you what I've done. Is you take, so you take the green one here, which I think is pin 16. Don't quote me on that. You cut that, and in my case, I solder it onto any of the ground pins or the ground cables, which are the black ones, and that means that the power supply is always on. So the moment that you plug it into the power supply is on. Unlike when it's in an x86, you press the power button and then it turns on. So this power supply will always be feeding power here. Yeah, so I've got the hard drive powered externally, and I've also got the fan running at full speeds off of one of the 12-volt ports. Where's that? Oh yeah, there it is. So I just got one of the plugs here, and I just cut the ground off and cut the 12-volt, one of the 12-volt cables that I wanted to use, and just wired up this to the fans and just soldered it. It's not just taped; it is actually soldered under there. My taping job, I'm not the best at that, but
it works.
It works. That's right. So on this particular Rock Pro 64, I've got the PCI SATA card here. So I've got this hard drive connected here over a SATA interface, and that's that blue cable that you can see in there. You also see here, this thing here, you'll see here as well, these terminal blocks. This isn't the first time I've been working on the Rock Pro 64, but this here is, oh, that's the fan. So that one is the fan. So the reason it's cut is because when I first got it, I couldn't get the fan working, so I thought I'd try and power it off something else in December 2020, and just left it. But now I've wired it up externally. So yeah, that's that. And then we've also got in there, as I showed you before, we've got the serial adapter as well. Okay, so it's still installing at the moment, and that will be a little bit longer. Okay, so the installation has finished, and we're now into the post-installation setup. The first thing it's going to ask you to do is install the bootloader, which is U-boot, onto the onboard flash, or the SPI flash as it's called. Now, currently this Slackware AArch64 only supports the Rock Pro 64 and the Pinebook Pro, and both of those need the bootloader installing into the flash, because that's where it's going to run from. So I'm going to say yes, and it'll tell you that, and then it will erase the flash. Okay, the erase operation is complete, the flash is erased, and now it's writing the bootloader to the flash. I've said that it takes about 5 minutes. Normally it takes about 3.5. The NAND write command does tell you which address it's writing to, but it doesn't give you any indication about what stage it's in, what percentage is complete. So instead of having all of that just scrolling off the screen, I decided to silence NAND write and simply give you a message telling you that it's going to take about 5 minutes instead, and to just hold on and wait. Okay, so the flashing was complete and it was successful. The next thing it's going to ask me is whether I want to remove the installer from the SD card. The reason for that is because the SD card image that I'm shipping, when you DD it to the SD card itself, it occupies about 1 GB on there. And that was simply because I thought, what's the bare minimum that you really can buy these days that's worthwhile having? And I thought 1 GB sounds about good to me. So I've got in here a 64 GB SD card, but only 1 GB of it is currently in use, and that's for the /boot partition. Of course, you can resize /boot to fully occupy and make use of the space on your SD card, and I'll include the documentation about how to do that. But this dialog here is suggesting that I remove the installer from the SD card. The simple reason for that is because the SD card contains the operating system initial RAM disk, or the OS init.rd as I call it. And at the moment it also contains the installer. The reason why you want to remove the installer is simply to do with space concerns. When you're upgrading the kernel, you want to make sure that there's sufficient space in /boot. Otherwise, you might have problems. You may end up with a corrupt kernel, or just some general badness may ensue. So I'm suggesting here that you remove the installer image from the SD card. The reason why it doesn't automatically remove it is simply because sometimes when you install Slackware, if you make a mistake and it gets a certain way through the installer, you can't revert, you can't go back. So if that's the case, it means that I can reboot the machine and reboot the installer off of the SD card. Whereas originally when I did the work, I just made it delete the installer, and I realized that was a bad idea. So the installer will remain until you remove it. You may think that just keeping the installer around might be useful, but in fact it won't be that useful as soon as you upgrade the kernel, because the kernel is kept separate from the installer. It's a separate file within /boot on that SD card. And the installer contains kernel modules for the running kernel. And if those two aren't aligned, it isn't going to work. So keeping the installer around for some future use is not worthwhile. It's only literally if you get to this point in time and you realise, actually, I want to reinstall. And this saves you re-DDing the image to the SD card again. So that's why it's asking you here. I'm going to go ahead and remove the installer. And everything else here is standard Slackware. So let's configure our network. Okay. So we just configured the network settings there. Now we're going to configure what starts at boot. I want RPC running because I use NFS. That's the only thing I ever set when I install these machines. Don't want any custom screen fonts. No. Let's say we're in London. We'll pick KDE, set ourselves a password. I'm going to type in I tried to type in a simple password, it didn't like that. Okay. Okay, so I've just set a password for that one, which of course I'll change later because you can see me typing it in. And there we go. And then we exit. Yes. And the system will boot. So now U-boot's booting from the SPI, which is the onboard flash. And there we go. You'll see this time around there's only one option in the boot menu, and that's because I've removed the installer. So that's the only thing to boot, and that's what it's booting. The kernel is booting. All the modules are being loaded. Maybe you can hear the hard drive being hammered away. This is the first boot, so it's going to be slightly slower while it creates SSH keys and stuff like that, and does a little bit of initial setup for some of the packages. And there's the machine, it's booted. Okay. And there we go. There is the Rock Pro 64. And there we go. Okay, so hopefully you found that useful and interesting, and you can see where we are with the state of the port right now. At the moment there's just a little bit of documentation left to write and a few scripts to get the distribution ready to be pushed out to the FTP site, but that's pretty much it. And the plan is to get it released in an alpha state in current form before the end of June. So keep an eye out on the website on arm.slackware.com, and I'll advertise it when it's ready. And if you're able to help with the project by, for example, contributing hardware model support, as I've talked about in previous podcasts, to enable it to run on all the other different hardware models, have a look at the website and there'll be more information there when it's time. So thanks, bye.